Amazing to have you all here, and just to appreciate everyone's timeliness, we're gonna get started, and if you know others who are joining, they can join as we go. I'm gonna get started now, so Roshini, if you can let me all switch to my screen. Thank you. Okay, well, welcome, as I said, to this International Climate Moments briefing. In this particular session, for those of you who know us and have attended other sessions that we've had, we will be covering the negotiations of the biodiversity COP16, which will be taking place in Cali, Colombia, later this year. So here's a bit of a rundown of what we're going to go through. Of course, we're going to introduce ourselves for those of you who are just joining us for the first time. We want to cover an overview, some of the key topics at COP16 and the implications they may have for indigenous peoples and local communities. And one very important thing here is that negotiations usually cover a myriad of topics, and we understand that others that we are not specifically prioritizing here may be of interest to your organizations. So please don't hesitate to write in the chat if there is something else you think we should be covering. Because just like we are doing this session today, we're going to be preparing some materials during the negotiations to support your work there. And finally, we're going to be talking a little bit about opportunities for engagement in the negotiations and to help move along the agendas that you are interested in. So now let me get started with introducing myself. For those of you who don't know me, I am Lina Salas. I am Colombian and based in Bogota. And I'm an activist, a campaigner. I've been working in the climate action scenario and working with indigenous peoples, local and Afro-descendant communities for close to 7 years. Particularly done a lot of work with the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities, supporting their actions. And here I'm joining you as part of this group that is working closely with the International Climate Politics Hub and the Food Nature Climate Dialogue to bring you these briefings. Joining me is Philippa Bailey, also from our team, and I'm going to let her introduce herself before moving on.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for attending today. As Lina says, I'm Philippa. I'm in the UK. And my involvement in this project is I help to coordinate all of the briefings. And so my email address, which will be in the presentation and I will put in the chat, is the place to contact if you've got any questions following on from the briefing. And I'm the person who sends out all of the information about the briefings and the follow-up. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Philippa. So you have a list here of other members of our team. If you have joined other briefings, you may have known them already. If you haven't, we're going to be delivering a couple of more sessions this year, so you might get to know them soon. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about the project before going into COP16. As I said, this is a joint initiative where we are developing and delivering both written and visual policy briefings. So we are having the conversations that we have here, but we're also sending written material, some summaries, some results of the discussions. And all of this is informed by policy intelligence from the International Climate Politics Hub. One of the big focuses that we're going to have in both sessions and documents is on the implications and opportunities for both indigenous peoples and local communities' rights around the conversations that take place in the international climate negotiations. We do these online briefing sessions in preparation, but then we will also have some in-place sessions during both COP16 and COP29. And we might be able to support some specific requests, as I said, on specific regions or certain topics based on your needs. We can chat about that on the email that Philippa is leaving you here so that you can reach out to us. Now I'll get started to not take too much time on COP16. So for those of you who don't know, the COP16 that we're talking about is the Conference of the Parties with the focus on biodiversity. It is done once every other year. We are reaching the 16th edition, which is going to take place in Cali, in Colombia, between the 21st and the 28th of October. Cali is a city located in the Pacific region of Colombia, and it has been chosen, according to government officials, because of how it displays biodiversity in the region, and how important it is to see how the negotiations will impact a territory like that. Now, to get started on some headlines, the Colombian government has been presenting this COP with two titles. The first one is At Peace with Nature, and this coordinates a lot with the government agenda for the peace negotiations with armed groups in the country. And the second is the COP of the People. So they have been pitching this idea that this will be the most participatory COP ever. And because of that, they have been both creating and attending sessions by other stakeholders, inviting different people to join, inviting different people to give input to documents and to the planning of the event. So some of you may have already joined. If you haven't, it's good to keep in mind that they are updating opportunities constantly in the COP CBD website of the Colombian government. You can just look it up like that, and you will find both the place and you will find the dates for further gatherings. Now, one of the important things about Colombia's position in these negotiations is that a couple of years ago, they submitted information saying they had already reached the 30 by 30 protection agreements. And so they are pushing for more action versus other stakeholders and other parties. Now, this COP is particularly important because 2 years ago in Montreal for COP15, the Kunming-Montreal Agreement signed up for some big things. It created a lot of expectations in their articles. And now this year is about seeing how it has been taken to reality or not, assessing and shifting direction where it's needed. What the countries had to do, very particularly for this year, was take the information that had been discussed in Kunming-Montreal and basically work on the specific needs of their country and how to bring them to reality. The way that countries do that is through the National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans, which are better known as NBSAPs. Now, the NBSAPs are pre-existing, but they're going to be renewed for this year. So one of the commitments countries had was to deliver the updates on their NBSAPs for this COP. We will be talking a lot about that as we go deeper into the topics. Then this year, there's also a need to take the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund and specify how it's going to be created, who is going to put money into it, and how it's going to be used and assigned. And then one of the big things is that the CBD is bringing forward a conversation on how to guarantee effective and full participation of Indigenous peoples and local communities, because in Montreal, this was stated into the official articles of the agreement. So specifying how that's going to happen will be key to the discussion this year. Now, I'm giving a little bit more of global context because of the things that tend to affect these negotiations. The first one is that this is an electoral year, a massive electoral year. I believe you have all seen in your regions some form of elections this year, but particularly there are some that have a big effect, like the US general elections, who tend to shift big time in focus on climate and biodiversity action, and the election of the new European Parliament, which is expected to come with variations on the country's positions versus the climate negotiation. The second thing is the continuation of regional wars that have been having a huge impact for the last couple of years, particularly on funding. When there are at large global or regional war situations, funds tend to go to humanitarian aid and war relief, and that tends to affect investment and international attention when it comes to this parties negotiation. And finally, there's the fact that usually attention that the biodiversity negotiations, and yet this year, because of the COP that is taking place later in Baku, it's likely that the biodiversity conversations will be much more prominent in the space. Now, with this in mind, let's have a look a little bit at how Colombia is shaping up their positions in the debate. The first is that Colombia has been doing regional gatherings in the country months prior to COP to work on the goals and the metrics that they're going to present, but they haven't yet delivered on the MBSAPs. So communities who may have participated in these encounters don't yet know what's going to happen with the information and the conversations they held. The other point is that Colombia has said they will prioritize 4 topics for their MBSAPs. One has to do with territorial management, and there are huge international expectations on this because of the land reform issues that are a big part of Colombia's history. The second has to do with benefit sharing, which I will explain a little bit more as we go deep into one of the topics. Then there's the matter of environmental crimes, how to find where they're happening, how to punish them. And finally, the governance of communities in the territories as a center of the conversation. The other important fact is that this is a government where the presidency and the ministries are super keen on advancing on regulations and on their climate goals, but the Congress is a more conservative traditional Congress pushing back a lot on government initiatives. So it's likely to have pushback once they are implemented. And as an organizer, Colombia is shaping up a couple of positions. So the first is that they have met with several indigenous groups, including the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity and a coalition of countries, of indigenous governances from the Amazon basin. And they have agreed publicly to push for the creation of a work plan on indigenous peoples inside this COP. There are 2 more issues at hand when it comes to the position of Colombia as an organizer. The first one is that there is still a lot to be defined. It seems that this year a lot of things around programming and priorities are taking place at a very late stage. So if you all have the feeling that maybe the organizers haven't answered to your requests or that you don't have enough information yet on things like side events, specific negotiations, or documents to give input, it's not just a feeling, it's kind of the general layout of this year's COP. And finally, there's the fact that because of the conversations after the peace agreement and the return of guerrilla dissidences to the country, there have been a lot of conversations around safety concerns. Earlier in the year, there was a threat from the dissidences of what used to be the FARC guerrilla to target the COP. But then later in the year, they came out with a statement saying they were keen on getting back to the negotiations table with the government, and as an act of display of peace, they will leave the convention alone. The government has also been assuring people that safety will not be a concern to anyone attending, but it's important to know that the region is a territory in dispute. We have left the global targets of the Kunming-Montreal Agreement here for you all, just to sort of have a refreshment on this. If you are not too familiar with them, again, the Biodiversity COP official page has the articles and the details of each article, but this is the grand layer of what it looks like. Now, we will be going specifically into some of these topics, as I said, for one reason, because we can't cover it all, but also because of what is being highly prioritized in the public discussion. Now, these are the 3 points that we will center on. First, as I told you about already, the MBSAPs, where countries are at, how it's aligning with the targets, and what is coming up for the implementation mechanisms. Then the conversation of finance, which we understand is fundamental. So how is it going to happen around resource mobilization, what percentage has to go to communities, and how to reach the 20 billion a year that is proposed by 2025. And finally, a big technical conversation, which is the digital sequencing information piece. We're going to be talking about benefit sharing here, as I said just before, and the implications of the Nagoya Protocol for these particular conversations. And of course, cross-cutting to these 3 topics are the establishment of the Indigenous Peoples body of participation based on Article 8J, so the subsidiary body. Now, while I'm going to start going into the topics, I would love to hear some thoughts in the chat on how you have felt the experience of planning this event, how far ahead things have gone, and if you feel like it's a little bit behind. And we would also love to hear your thoughts on what other topics you think are a priority for yourselves and your organization, so that as we come closer to COP16, we can deep dive into them. For now, I will start and then I can read some chat updates later. So let's go into a bit of the state of affairs from the MBSAPs. As I said, we're sharing the presentation and here are some links for you to go for more information. Now, while all the countries are supposed to present their updates this year, so far only 20 countries have done so. Interestingly enough, there has been progress because a couple of months ago, there were only 8 countries who have submitted. So several countries have come forward lately, and we have important submissions like the European Union and China. However, some of the big players are still not amongst the ones who have submitted. So for now, countries like the United States or Brazil are countries that we don't quite know their stand on for the targets that they're going to be following in the next couple of years. Now, while it is expected for countries to comply with this delivery, if they fail to comply, this creates disincentives for follow-through. So it might put the success of the Kunming-Montreal Agreement at risk. Now, this framework that was created 2 years ago was very progressive, and it was advancing at a very fast pace. So that's why it's so important to not put it at risk this year with not following through on delivering the MBSAPs. The other bit about this is that there are a lot of conversations in progress around how to build synergies between the countries' indicators on biodiversity and on climate change. So far, the conversations have been very parallel. They have tended to be far away from each other, and one of the things being targeted is for them to come through a little bit more. Finally, there will be a lot of coordinated efforts, meaning that parties are expected to present MBSAPs that combine and work together, understanding that country borders are not ecosystem borders and that they need to create regional action. And so they will also be determining how multilateral work is going to happen around biodiversity and how much transnational initiatives are needed to advance in these conversations. Also, however, these coordinated efforts will be a challenge in regions where there is conflict, but also in regions where there is electoral tensions. So those will all be at play in the conversation. As I said, we're going to be presenting a little bit of the implications of the MBSAPs for Indigenous peoples and local communities. And now the first thing to keep in mind is that the MBSAPs are determining the future of finance at national levels. Now, I know that I said we're going into finance, but this is sort of a topic that crosses both lanes. So whatever actions, targets, goals, or even territories are not included into the MBSAPs this year may be at a huge risk for implementation. I've been reminded here to just once again give you a note as to what the NDCs are, which are the nationally determined contributions, and they are pretty much the equivalent of the MBSAPs in the biodiversity conversations, and they are due to be presented 9 to 12 months before COP, meaning that very early in the year, we're supposed to see them, and they are supposed to dialogue with the MBSAPs. Now, the other big situation about Indigenous peoples and local communities in this conversation is that, again, there is an article of the Global Biodiversity Framework that talks about guaranteeing effective and full participation for communities, but that doesn't necessarily always translate to the national plans. So we're expecting to see how it comes through, and it's also a great and powerful moment to pressure governments into being ambitious with how they're going to make that participation effective. But not only on being ambitious, also on being very precise on how they're going to make those a reality. The final point here that is very important is that there have been reports about the previous MBSAPs, the ones that haven't been renewed yet, and the report showed that less than 1/3 of these MBSAPs actually considers aspects like land tenure, which means there is a significant gap between what science is saying and the implications of protecting territorial rights for protecting biodiversity and what is actually happening when countries commit to action. And even worse, less than half of those MBSAP countries had communities as their implementation partners, which means that participation was not being guaranteed effectively until now. We have linked a report here for you to have a look at some more numbers. One of the things that we believe is going to be key is for you to have this information at hand when talking with stakeholders like funders or the media, so that you can bring out the conversation of how much is still left to be done, how far we are from full and effective participation. However, there are some opportunities. So here are the ones that we have brought. The first one is joining the conversation for the local frameworks, of course. So if your country has not yet delivered their MBSAPs, it's important to go to their local websites and find out how they are collecting information to them. Some countries may have specific gatherings, or some countries that have reduced budget around this can have open calls. In both cases, you can join these actions. And then you can also find and study the results of your country. We have left you a link here to check them out if they have already submitted. If not, you can keep following up to see when they submit and go through the text to understand what's going on in your region. Now that's at the local or national levels rather. Then there's demanding more action during COP16. So first, we will see that there are some countries that are not pushing for enough action, and there's a need to demand more there. There's also the chance to study success cases. So if you know of places where your communities have engaged successfully with governments or with other stakeholders, bringing them to the table to be used as success experiences will be very powerful. And also encourage voluntary peer review mechanisms. One of the systems that the CBD has set in place for the review of the MBSAPs is that peers can help others voluntarily. So this, in short terms, means that some countries can have a look at other countries' MBSAPs and do a review for them and show them where they're not being ambitious enough, where they're going on a good path. So if you believe, for instance, that your country or one of the countries in the region that you work with has not made enough progress, but you are partners with other governments who have significant stands, you could ask those governments to ask for a peer review of your country, and that would put pressure on them to create more ambitious action. And finally, highlighting the contradictions. As I have said, many countries are promising a lot, but those are very different from what they actually set in place for action. So you can connect your demands to the existing contradictions, and of course, bring reports on failure to comply. You can have a look at your country's profile in the official website of the CBD, have a look at what responsibility they have based on what types of species are in their territories, what kind of territories are protected or not, and how much they have done in the past few years. And then bring these reports to the table to demand action. One of the things that I believe important to tell you all here is that usually around this stage for COP, we would have a couple of open calls on the website that tell you where you can submit information, where you can ask for reviews, etc. But in this case, they're not open so far. We are expecting them to open soon. And if the case comes that more open calls are available for you to inform the official body of governance of CBD, we will be sharing them along. Now with that, and I know that this is just a brushstroke of everything that comes with this topic, I'm going to pass to the second topic of finance. But please, if there is something we have not covered on the MBSAPs or some information that you would like to go deeper into, go into the chat or open your mic. I'm just going to leave a second here. Also, if you want to share any of your experiences with the negotiation process, we would love to hear it. So I'm going to pause for a second just to hear you all out or to listen to what you have to say based on what comes up in the chat. Jenny from Aida, I guess, is asking if we can expand about the peer review mechanism. Absolutely. So the peer review mechanism is an open-ended space where any country can volunteer to review the MBSAPs of other countries. They have to submit a formal request to do it, and then it follows a process of receiving information, regulating, and have joint conversations about how to improve the MBSAPs. Only 2 case studies have been submitted so far. If I recall correctly, it's the former MBSAPs of Ethiopia and India, but I may be wrong. We can check the link to see if those are the specific countries that have. And it's an official mechanism, so all the information on the results of the peer review will also appear formally at the CBD. One of the things to keep in mind here is that parties are not mandated to comply with recommendations that they are given in the peer review mechanism. So it's not necessarily that they will be forced to change their goals or to make them more ambitious, but there will be pressure, evidence, and support from another party that they're not reaching far enough. It takes a specific close relationship to another party, to ask them to do that kind of conversation. We also have here Alvaro talking about some of the key topics that come to mind. Addressing criminalization of land defenders, we definitely think that calls for like a whole session to talk about it. And advancing human rights-based conservation approaches. This, however, is not so far off the conversation because, as we said, one of the key things that is going to happen this year is the conversation on the subsidiary body of Article 8J, which talks about how to implement a body of participation for Indigenous peoples. And a lot of the conversation here is human rights-based conservation. That's kind of one of the elements within the Article 8J conversation. And on regulating biodiversity credits, we'll talk a little bit about when we go into finance, so don't worry about it. And then we have Karen, who has asked if it's possible to share this document with your organization. It definitely is. And we're going to send it in Portuguese, Karen. So we will give you the version that you can share in the proper language. And we will also be sending like a brief summary because we understand that the presentation and the recording can be a lot. So we will still give you a shorter version. I'm glad this answers your question, Jenny. There are any other questions, or if anyone wants to open mic, we're open to it. If not, we'll jump to our next topic. Okay, I'll move on for now, but looking forward to more thoughts on the chat. Now let's go into finance, and here we will talk about biodiversity credits. So first, one of the key things to know about finance is that the Montreal Kunming Agreement included the creation of the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund. And what's going to happen this year is that the fund, its establishment, its capacity are being discussed. Because so far, the promises that have been made for funding are not enough for what needs to happen if action is going to be radical and significant. So one of the things they will be defining is what are the financial targets and how they impact each of the topics in the negotiations. If you are similar to either the biodiversity COP or the climate change COP dynamics, you will find that some topics receive a lot of attention and get big pulls for funding, and others sort of lag behind. So that has consequences, of course, on how much can be done. The other bit is talking about how to align both investment from parties or from private stakeholders and debt relief to the fund. For many years, there has been a lot of conversations on how countries can relieve debt through action for conservation. And this, again, comes to the table this year. The other one is achieving the percentage of funding that goes to communities. One of the things that was stated in Montreal is that 20% of the funds should go to communities. This is a little bit broad. It talks about community groups, so it's not just Indigenous peoples and local communities, which also goes to ask the question of how they are measuring the percentage. And we will have a lot of advancements onto that conversation this year, particularly because we know that direct finance has always been a challenge in these spaces. And finally, as Alvaro pointed out, we have the issue of the biodiversity credits. So biodiversity credits started coming big into the conversation 1 or 2 years ago in the climate COPs as well. And basically they try to establish somewhat of an improved mechanism around what happens with carbon markets. However, again, there's the risk of them becoming one more carbon market situation where there is a lot of controversy around private stakeholders being able to buy their way out of risky situations with climate. So a lot of greenwashing risks, and also the risk that private stakeholders have control over how they deliver on transparency and on the claims that communities can file when they're not complying. This conversation has not advanced as much as the carbon markets has, and there are only very few examples in regions of projects that are in place, but a lot more are expected to come this year, and so this is likely to be brought to the conversation. Now that bit is on the framework fund because biodiversity credits, sorry for 1 second, I'll just plug my computer. Biodiversity credits are one of the innovative mechanisms for funding, so that's why they keep coming up here. However, there is another broader conversation which is called the financial system reform. And again, if you have been to any of the negotiations, you will probably have heard of this, but it basically implies that the way the financial system is set right now, it's not working for communities. It's working for private stakeholders and creating disincentives for conservation, and it's actually creating more harmful subsidies than investment into supporting nature. So a lot of what's going to happen this year is organizations trying to bring nature to the center of the financial conversation, both in terms of creating new sources of funding, like the reduction of harmful subsidies, and aligning the existing sources. And the other one, which again, I have said some of the topics cross paths, is digital sequencing information. Now, I'm not yet going to explain what it is, and I'm sorry if you're a little lost, but I promise it will make sense in a little bit. DSI is not yet bringing shared benefits to countries where information is being extracted from, so there will be a lot of conversation on how to make that a reality. Now, the amount that gets collected from digital sequencing information and that goes to funding solutions could reach anywhere from $10 billion per year to 200 billion per year, depending on how it's framed. In the first case, it would be if we are only getting money from the revenue and up to 1% of the revenue. And in the second case is if funds come from everything that goes into global retail sales, which could reach up to 200 million. Now, while the percentage is super small versus what companies are making for the products they make with this digital sequencing information, there's still pushback from both certain countries and large corporations. Again, if you're a little bit lost in this digital sequencing information conversation, don't worry, because we'll go back to it. But the main thing to take here is that setting in place mechanisms where money that is made through getting genetic information from biodiversity existing in certain countries has the potential to take the world far ahead of its existing goal with a very reduced percentage of what companies are making for it. So while they're going to be pushing back, it's super necessary to bring this conversation to the front and to push for it. What's going to happen in terms of indigenous peoples in this conversation? I am again going back to target 22, and I'm repetitive of this because this is the main mechanism that's going to advance the conversation. However, other targets in the global biodiversity framework that exists target communities. They talk about land rights, they talk about effective participation, they talk about proper distribution of funds. But this is the central one, right? So with this target and its implications, one of the things that are coming here are conversations around multilateral development banks and how they can come to the table to increase finance for communities specifically. Here with the multilateral is probably one of the places where there has still been more reluctance to do direct funding and where bureaucracy conversations have been very much at the center. So advancing how they provide funds that can go directly versus intermediaries will be fundamental. The second one is DSI conversations. So one of the things that happen here is that the genetic information that is being taken out to create pharmaceutical or beauty projects are very often found in indigenous territories. So those communities, those countries should be getting funds from the sales that they create. It's not happening so far. Then there is a conversation which has been sort of coming in and out of the table for the last few years in conversations, which is the inclusion of an Afro-descendant community's body of governance as well, which also comes with funds, and the conversation on separating versus bringing together indigenous peoples and local communities as the stakeholders. The final thing that has a lot to do with the finance conversation here is that the work program for the Global Biodiversity Fund right now is pushing to increase funding for indigenous peoples, but particularly it's pushing to improve how these funds are deployed. So when you talk to stakeholders like the GEF, you will find that you can still make a lot of room for improving how the funds are reaching your territories. And here are some of the opportunities to do that. So first, local meetings in the lead up to COP. One could be scheduling your own sessions with the stakeholders that you already know are in this financial conversation. The other one is that the Colombian Ministry of Environment has already shown a lot of political will to push for more commitment to funds for indigenous communities, so they have the capacity to push other countries to join financial commitments. And once again, going back to Alvaro's question, controversial conversations on biodiversity credits. A lot of the stakeholders who are going to be at COP16 will be talking about biodiversity credits, and they're going to be talking a lot about biodiversity credits as a solution. So it's important to be in that conversation to talk exactly about how it's going to take place and how it will be or won't be beneficial. The second one has to do with the official agenda for participation. Again, going back to the subsidiary body on Article 8J. And there's also sessions and pledges that will be coming out, and they will be saying who puts the resources into the common pool, what industries are going to enter the conversation in different funds, to what extent, and how those funds are distributed. And then there will be sessions about the monitoring mechanisms, because one of the things that has not advanced as much is the monitoring processes. So each fund, each party that puts pools into the fund is measuring things differently. They are giving out different transparency reports. And because of that, compiling and comparing information tends to be tricky. Now that will continue to be tricky, mainly because different countries have different capacity. Not every country can set up extremely sophisticated mechanisms to monitor action, and that is to be expected. However, some basic standards should be set in place for that conversation. And finally, there are the synergies and the challenges of connecting the biodiversity conversation with the conversation on climate action. First, on opportunities, there's the fact that a lot of the financial goals align, they make sense together, and they combine to talk about multi-benefits. So when you fund one thing that is biodiversity targeted, you end up benefiting the conversations around climate change. However, there are some challenges. One is the fact that there are limited resources. So oftentimes countries will stop financing a solution or reduce financing it to finance another one. And also the controversial mechanisms that are receiving a lot of attention. We know that carbon markets has been one of them, and it receives a lot of attention, but then it receives a lot of pushback from communities, as is to be expected. I'm not going to stop too much on the graph, but you can, if you're curious about this, look it up when you have access to the full details of the presentation, which basically is showing for each of the topics how the conversation is connecting. So the lines that you see in blue are the places where climate and biodiversity conversations have positive interactions, and the red ones are where they're having negative interactions. And the source is there as well, so you can go to the document that explains it a little bit better. Now, finally, in the financial ecosystem, there's also a need to keep in mind that this is a longer timeline. It's not only about the presenting the MBSABs or the decisions that will be made in October, but it's also about how then at COP29, there will be new financial promises for climate that will either compete or coordinate with the biodiversity efforts, how next year will be key for countries to show results, to open advocacy spaces for the bigger conversations, and then how COP30 next year is gonna be the biggest COP in the latest years to push for action. So all this to bring to your attention that whatever is happening around the conversations for finance now is part of a broader spectrum that will take us eventually to the big negotiations of 2025. Now we're going into the third key topic, but first, I wanted to just stop here to look at the chat for a bit. We have had first Jennifer Corpus, who has given you some more details on the review process so that you can have more answer to that question. Then there was a question here on if there's a space where the conversation of mechanisms for direct funding to Indigenous peoples, so where the conversations are going on, I imagine. And Filipa has shared something from Clarify, but there's also, we did briefing session on nature finance a couple of months ago, and we have the presentation that sort of sums up some of the conversation going on. We can also share that document. There's also, Lais is saying a very important point here, which is that a lot of companies that work on carbon markets are also going to participate at COP16, which means that they will be pushing for carbon markets at COP16. It's good to keep in mind those stakeholders and have a sense of where they are going to participate. And I've been asked to speak a little bit slower. Sorry to the interpreters for how I get excited and get carried away. I will go slower now. And finally, to Nancy's question, Tanya was also saying that yes, RRI has a working group. It's called Path to Scale, and it's also working around these mechanisms for direct funding. One thing that's important to keep in mind is that direct funding is still limited, and that the results are not showing as at a broad scale as could be expected so far, because precisely of all the barriers that were coming. So we will likely see a lot more reports coming up of what has happened with the funds and how they have been successful in implementation, and it's good to keep track of that conversation. Okay, after these comments, and with the different conversation that we've had here, oh, sorry, I'm gonna go to Jennifer's comment here because I think it's very important for everyone to keep in mind. And it's that right now, based on what has been going on in the meetings, everything around resource mobilization is not agreed upon yet. So that means that in the conversations that are leading up to COP16 and during the negotiations, it's possible to still introduce language of direct access to finance. So that will be a significant change, right? If that conversation is explicit, there will be the need for it to then come down to the national agreements and regional agreements that come after the formal global agreement is signed. And there will be some pavilions that will be focusing on finance where you can talk to the funders that will be there. So that's another key thing to keep in mind. I don't know, Jennifer, if you want to take a moment here to tell us a bit about those opportunities, because I feel there's so much key information that you have in hand that we would love to hear from. Feel free to open your mic.
Yeah, thank you, Lina. No, I think I already put them in the chat. I try to divide it in terms of the formal process, so the formal negotiations, and the informal process. There are many, many opportunities in terms of the formal process, because the big decisions that COP16 needs to take are well, number one, on resource mobilization, and that whole, as you mentioned, the whole decision is bracketed Okay, and then of course we also have the monitoring framework, which is one of the major decisions at COP16, the major agenda items for decision. And there is target 19 there, which talks about access of Indigenous peoples to finance. And there's an opportunity there also to talk about direct access. At the working group on DSI second meeting, which happened early in August, in Montreal, the IAFP was able to successfully introduce language on direct access in the decision, the draft recommendations on digital sequence information. So there's an opportunity to talk about it there as well. And maybe the other agenda item is the new program of work on Article 8J. And part of the new program of work is a task on direct access to finance. So those are some of the opportunities in the formal process. And in the informal process, there's also a lot of interest on direct access. We will probably be called on to define what direct access means because there are many, many different definitions floating around. So one important space to influence is the Global Environment Facility Pavilion. They are the ones that are administering the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund. And this is the fund that said that 20% should go programmatically to Indigenous peoples. And it's tricky because programmatic means that it still goes to the country, and Indigenous peoples will have to nest their proposals and their requests for funds within the country proposal. And so that's one thing and what the Jeff said to us is that they get their guidance from the COP and from the Jeff Council. And so if we want to change, this current practice of only countries being able to access funds, we need to have a COP decision and a Global Environment Facility Council decision. And so I think COP16 is as good a place to start as any to revise the mandate of the GBF fund. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ding. I hope that helps out with clarification. And I definitely agree that there's a lot to be done in those spaces. Jenny, I think it might be interesting for you to connect precisely with Jing and the conversations that she has highlighted out here. I'm gonna try and ask some of the team members supporting us here to give you the Spanish version of the text that she has sent so that you can have more information on that. But definitely the topic of direct funding in the official spaces will be important. And if this delegation is attending and is going to be accredited, it would be great to have them drop by the GEF pavilion and have more unofficial conversations. But I'm gonna let that connection happen through the translations. And now I'm going to go into the digital sequencing information. And as I said, we're going to be connecting that with some of the conversations before. Now, this is a very technical conversation. And if at some point you find yourselves a little bit lost in the language or the understanding, please let me know. In overall conversations about biodiversity, one of the references around genetic resources is the Nagoya Protocol. The Nagoya Protocol was created and has been implemented around understanding how the fact that some resources exist in certain territories and that their DNA has the potential to create important products for the world, with responsibility for what happens with those genetic resources, how it's being collected, how it's being used, and what happens afterwards with that. Now, here we have highlighted one text that we think is key in highlighting how it's limited and what needs to happen and what needs to advance in this year's conversation. So I'm just gonna read that and then explain it a little bit more. What we have here says that the issue of DSI arose due to the increasing speed and falling costs of sequencing, which have resulted in an enormous quantity of biological data being produced and stored in publicly accessible data banks, which are used for research and development, including for commercial purposes. This happens in the absence of benefit sharing obligations, and many parties and other actors are concerned that this will negatively impact on the third objective of the CBD and the objective of the Nagoya Protocol. Now I'm gonna explain a little bit more on that in detail. Basically, what this is saying is that in the recent years, it's become a lot simpler to take samples, biological samples from territories, input them into databases, and make them accessible to anyone who wants to use that genetic information for research, and that research can be used then to create products for commercial use. Now, what happens with this is that there are two types of resources used. There's genetic resources and there's digital sequencing information. At the first one, we are talking about genetic level, and at the second one, we are talking about biological sample. And there are differences between how they lay out in territories. So far, for the usage of one, you have had to talk about benefit sharing and giving back in some way. For another, there hasn't. So that's what's going on right now. It's basically that digital sequencing is taken out of territories, is used to develop products that then probably give to billion-dollar industries, and the territories that those sequences come from receive none of the benefits of that product. That has particular impact on indigenous territories, where there has been a history of extraction of knowledge and extraction of sequences. And the sequences end up benefiting humanity hugely on aspects like medicine and agriculture. Now, there's a conversation there called the biopiracy conversation, which basically states that communities are being robbed of their rights over the genetic information that inhabits their territories. And so there's need for a regulation that allows for the benefits that come from that to be shared with the territories. However, as you can imagine, there is reluctance from powerful stakeholders to regulate their action and also to share benefits. So what is going to happen in COP is that the parties are going to be talking about what regulations to set in place. About, for instance, is all the pharmaceutical companies who are using digital sequencing information have to give a percentage of their sales to a common fund around biodiversity, or to specific territories or countries where they're getting that information from, or if these open access databases have some restrictions around commercial use, and those restrictions will come with charges for the commercial use, which again are funds that can then be used for solutions. That's the conversation that will take place. And what's likely to happen with that conversation is that big players, the big governments that have a lot of push at the negotiations, will probably not necessarily want clear and demanding language, because there is connections, as always, with the industries, right? And so preliminary statements and commitments are likely to be more ambitious than the actual end agreement that is binding. So it's possible that some governments have a big conversation about this and make a pledge, maybe among some of them or in a regional level, but the global end statement will probably still be very vague and will probably get a lot of pushback. And there's a note that was left here that I think is super important, and it's the fact that there's a big conversation, not just on benefits in terms of money, but also in terms of consultation, right? So free, prior, and informed consent of communities has not been taking place so far to target and obtain those digital materials, right? Those sequencing information, those genetic resources. So it needs to be incorporated into all the conversations. Now, with that, we're going to be closing on the topics, but mainly because we want to have a little bit more of a conversation of what opportunities are coming. And I think the biggest conversation is on mapping the stakeholders, basically on understanding who is standing with communities and who is likely to do pushback on the conversations for this year. We have stated some of the stakeholders here, and we would love to either have you open your mic or give us some messages on the chat to give more details on where you see your governments or other stakeholders that you have worked with talk about this conversation. In the opposers bin that we have put here, I have mainly highlighted three stakeholders that have already openly created pushback on the benefit sharing bit of DSI, which are Japan and Switzerland. As parties, they don't make very explicit statements. Rather, what they have been saying throughout the conversation is that it's not so easy to regulate these industries, that this biological information is not necessarily always too clear where it's coming from, and that because of that, you can't push too much for that process. However, there's also opposition from the front of corporations, and GSK, the large pharmaceutical, is one of the largest opposers, definitely because this implies billions of dollars in profit for them that will be going to a fund. There are some countries that I'm stating here are kind of in the middle, which are Brazil and the European Union, because they have a lot of push, they have a lot of capacity for action, and likely the positions that these governments take will influence a bunch of other governments. However, they have not been as obvious in their stance so far. And then we have allies, which have been working already on these issues. Somebody who was asking who has more information on this, the AIPP and the Meridian Institute are part of a coalition that is working on this issue. And there's a coalition of African countries who has been particularly keen on bringing the digital sequencing information conversation, and that is asking for specific language on the agreements. And finally, the Colombian government seems to be particularly strong on stance this year, and particularly strong in presence because it's being the host. So it's likely that it's going to be heard by a lot of countries, not only in the region, but globally. Now, if you have any thoughts of stakeholders that you believe are at some point of the spectrum in the conversation, we would love to get your thoughts here on the text. Or if you want to open mic to talk about it. If not, I'm going to go into an exercise which we can work on together, or we can get some final thoughts from here. But basically what we have done here is have a look at some of the MBSAPs that were already presented and from countries that have a particular impact on Indigenous peoples' territories. Now, I brought them here just two very short texts, and I want to ask you how you would address conversations on these topics if you were asked by these different stakeholders. Now, one of the things that is happening is that the European Union has been working on putting forward a proposal for legally binding restoration targets from the European Union. This basically means that the EU wants to make it so that all of their countries are legally forced to comply with restoring ecosystems that they degrade. So far, it's not mandatory. It's voluntary if they want or don't want to restore ecosystems. And another article that we have brought here comes from the MBSAPs of China. They say that they are committed to improve resource utilization efficiency, comply with the requirements for access to genetic resources and related traditional knowledge and benefit sharing, and promote the establishment of a sustainable biodiversity system. Now, remember how we were talking before about the difference between genetic resources and DSI and benefit sharing? This is one of the players that is already making a statement about it. China is saying that whatever comes out of the negotiations, they will comply with. However, they are very purposefully naming genetic resources and not DSI when they make their articles, which means that there could be a loophole there. And they're specifically naming traditional knowledge, which, as we know, comes with the conversation of free, prior, and informed consent. So the question that I have for you all, and I would love to hear some thoughts, is if you are approached by either parties or the media or funders or corporations, and you have to talk about these types of articles, what kind of messages would you like to bring to that conversation? I'm gonna leave some space for mic open, but also if you want to put it on chat, and if not, I can go ahead and ask some of you for your thoughts. there's a lot of silence coming from you on this particular exercise, and I understand that this is a hard question to ask. I also think it's good for it to be an exercise that then you do with your organizations. You can go back and study some of the key articles of the agreements of the MBSABs and study how you want to frame messaging. One of the things that we recommend for organizations who are bringing delegations to COP is to prepare your positions. So you can take this information, take the information of the existing MBSABs from your countries and other countries who relate to yours, and have a thought at what is it that you want to bring to the conversation. Are you going to focus your stand on free, prior, and informed consent in digital sequence, or are you going to become big experts at biodiversity credits because that's what is affecting your region? Or are you going to talk about both with a specific position? A lot of what happens is that organizations that come as observers to the negotiations are asked for their position and don't necessarily have a defined stand on certain topics. Tanya is asking a question here. You're asking for the EU regulation. You would want to understand how the proposal will incorporate FPIC and benefit sharing from the restoration for IPLCs. That's a fantastic question to ask members of the negotiations from the European Union. And this is exactly what I mean. If you know the articles and you know the countries that you relate to, in this case, let's imagine Tanya is very carefully studying the MBSABs of the European Union, and she sees, oh, they want to enforce restoration targets, but how will they make sure that FPIC plays a role into those targets? How will they benefit share from that process of, okay, then I will go and into the pavilion that they have, or into panels where the negotiators will be addressing conversation, or even in closed-door conversations, Tanya can bring these questions forward and ask them to be more explicit about them in future pledges that they are making, to develop them in follow-up documents to the MBSABs, and even to change their positions based on how they have seen it evolve and on the limitations they have had so far in FPIC. And Lucas was asking me to repeat the question. This is basically an exercise. It's just to take these examples and try to think of how you would bring conversations to the table on this. So if you had a chance to talk to the negotiators, what would you ask for? Or what would you ask them about, considering that these are the framings that they have? If you were to talk to the media, let's imagine, for instance, that journalists come up to you as representatives from your organizations and tell you, hey, China has agreed to comply with anything that comes out of this meeting in terms of genetic resources. What are your thoughts on that? Right? So the idea is for you to prepare your statements and say, okay, well, I will say to the media that we want to push on FPIC, that we want to see that affirmation that they're making also apply to digital sequencing, etc. It's basically to think of how you will frame your messages, considering what is coming out of the MBSABs and on the conversation so far. And if you have more answers or more questions to this one, that sounds good, and we can include it here in the chat. If not, I'm gonna let Filipa give us some closing thoughts and the link to our survey, but we're of course open to any more questions or cases you want to present, and to keep talking about what comes up from the negotiations in the coming weeks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lina, and thank you everybody for your engagement. We know that with these briefings, everybody is coming to these topics with different levels of experience and different aspirations for the processes. So we do understand it's quite hard to, to make a presentation that meets everybody where they are at and with the way that they want to move forward. So we really invite you to let us know what works for you, what doesn't work for you, what more information you might like to receive. As Lina has said, the presentation will be translated into Spanish, Portuguese, and Bahasa Indonesia, and we will send that link out to everybody who registered for this webinar, whether they were able to attend or not, and also to our WhatsApp group, which you'll find out about. If you don't know it already, you'll find out about that when we send out the presentations. So yeah, I just want to say thank you to Lina. I would encourage you to follow for COP16, particularly the work of the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, the IIFB. They represent the Indigenous caucus within the CBD process. And because of this year's meeting being held in Colombia, they're in very close connection with particularly Colombian indigenous organizations, but others as well. And so as a route to finding out which issues are being discussed and the outcomes of those negotiations, I think following the IIFB is a really good idea. I can put a link to that as well in the chat. But please do take a moment. It's literally 2 minutes to fill out our feedback, and we really appreciate that so much. I'll put it now. Thank you.
I'm just quickly going to answer some of the things we have here on the chat. Lais, you were asking what's the best way to connect. So we have, Philippa shared her email and we can chat through email. We also have a WhatsApp group through which we share information on the briefing. So you can also ask to be added to that, and you will get information on both the official sessions and the documents that we will have there. We also have Kaep from the Republic of South Africa, who is thanking us for the space and welcoming the opportunity to partner. So if any of you all who are here is interested in partnering with them, they're sharing their contacts here. I think it's great that these spaces are also a collective way to connect, to engage with people who are interested in the same topics, and to create more pressure to advance the negotiations. There are a lot of ways in which probably all of you here will want to push for the same direction. So if you can get in touch, share initiatives, share actions that you will be doing and programming, that's a great way to make sure that actions can take place. To be added to the WhatsApp group, Philippa has just shared the link here on the chat, and you can just access that. It's not a group that we have big long conversations on constantly. It's more that we send the information there and provide updates, and we can also receive questions about the information there from you all. Several people have been sharing their data too, so if you want to share and connect with others, please feel free to do so as you feel the feedback. And thank you all so much for joining us. We will be sending out more information for next sessions.
Thank you.